Then we move to the third stage, and the third stage is God's response. And God says, I will beat you as a moth, I'll beat you as a lion, and I'll remove my presence and depart from you. A moth weakens, a lion tears apart. And he says, if my weakening of you doesn't change you, if my dismemberment of you in some way doesn't change you, I will have to remove my presence and depart from you. And this is where I look at our current cultural crises in North America today. Evidently, we won't turn to him by just becoming weaker. We may not even turn to him when we are in some way mangled in some form, I don't know. But what I think right now is happening in our cultural crises is a loss of wisdom. We do not seem to understand right from wrong anymore. We have no moral point of reference on the basis of which to make our decisions. Did you ever hear of the man in Leicestershire, England, who used to go to work every day and on the way would stop outside a clockmaker store and synchronize his watch with a clock that stood outside? And one day the clockmaker stopped him and said, I'm amazed that every day you stop and synchronize your watch with my clock. What kind of work do you do? He said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this. I'm the timekeeper in the factory nearby, and the clocks in the factory don't work very well. So I synchronize my watch with your clock every morning because I have to ring the bell at 4 o'clock every afternoon at the end of the day's shift. The clockmaker starts laughing and says, you're not going to believe this. My clock doesn't work very well either. I synchronize it with the watch that I hear, with the bell that I hear from the factory at 4 o'clock every afternoon. What happens when two wrong watches correct themselves by each other? Pardon the grammar, they're going to get wronger and wronger all the time. And what's happened in our cultural crisis? Nobody describes this better than G.K. Chesterton, writing in the middle of this century, talking about the individual who wanted to rebel against everything, wanted to overturn all the moral precepts by which a culture had lived, calling himself or herself a skeptic. And this brilliant English journalist captured that phenomenon in these words. Please hear me, I'll have to race through it and move to my final point. This is profound, so you have to listen carefully. This new rebel who rebels against everything and a skeptic will not entirely trust anything. He has no loyalty, therefore he can never be a true revolutionist. And the fact that he doubts everything gets in his way when he wants to denounce anything. For all denunciation implies a moral doctrine of some kind. And the modern revolutionist doubts not only the institution he denounces, but the doctrine by which he denounces it. Thus, he writes one book complaining that imperial oppression insults the purity of women. Then he writes another book, a novel, in which he insults it himself. He curses the Sultan because Christian girls lose their virginity, then curses Mrs. Grundy because they keep it. As a politician, he cries out that war is a waste of life, then as a philosopher that life itself is a waste of time. A Russian pessimist will denounce a policeman for killing a peasant, then prove by the highest philosophical principles that the peasant ought to have killed himself. A man denounces marriage as a lie, then denounces aristocratic profligates for treating it as a lie. The man of this school goes first to a political meeting where he complains that savages are treated as if they were beasts. Then he takes his hat and umbrella and goes to a scientific meeting where he proves that they practically are beasts. In short, the modern revolutionist, being an infinite skeptic, is always engaged in undermining his own minds. In his book on politics, he attacks men for trampling on morality. In his book on ethics, he attacks morality for trampling on men. Therefore, the modern man in revolt has become practically useless for all purposes of revolt. By rebelling against everything, he's lost his right to rebel against anything. You see, Chesterton said it in a simpler way. He put it this way: any time you remove a fence, always pause long enough to find out why it was put there in the first place. When God gave us the moral law, it was to remind me that my worship was sacred, that my body was sacred, my words were sacred, my time was sacred, the property I owned was sacred. And these inviolable sanctities were preserved in those 10 words. And it is the desacralization of all of these that has put us in the mess that we find ourselves. Isn't it true that the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing? Alas, it is much worse. A person may end up believing in anything. What happens when life breaks down? When there is systemic contradiction? The closer you get to God, the more closer you get to reason. The farther you move from God, the farther away you move from reason. God's love unmerited, desperately needed. God's heartache that we do not keep our will. God's response, I'll be to your moth, a lion, I'll remove my presence and depart from you. But that's not the way he ends. He ends in chapter 14 and says to Hosea to go and love her again. And he says, I'll heal your backsliding and love you freely, for mine anger is turned away from you. Ladies and gentlemen, the one word that defines the Christian faith that is writ large is the word forgiveness. God forgives you. God forgives me and gives us a chance to start afresh. Jim Bakker, in one of his books, tells the story of the time he was in prison after that sad event in the 1980s. One day, wearing his overalls, he was cleaning the latrines in the prison when a guard came to him and said, Jim, there's somebody here to see you. He said, I don't want to see anybody. He said, no, I think you want to see this person. He said, I'm filthy. He said, yeah, that's right. You may go and change. And Jim was going to change. He said, no, this is what has happened to me. And with all of the splashes from the water on the floor and all of the tragedy that had befallen this gentleman, he looked at himself, embarrassed by what he looked like, but he put the broom and mop aside and walked over to the waiting room. And in his own words, he said, I walked over to the waiting room and was stunned when I saw Billy Graham standing there. And Billy took 3 steps towards him and wrapped his arm around him and embraced him. And Jim Bakker said, I wept like a little child, and realizing that my name symbolized all that was corrupt to society. His name symbolized all that was pure, and I was being held in the embrace of a man who was pure. You know, if that human acceptance does so much for you and me, think of what it is when God himself puts his arms around you and says, welcome home. What love is this? It is God's love, and no other love can be defined until that love has properly been understood. I close with the words of one of the most beautiful songs of the Welsh revival. To be honest with you, if I had a voice, I'd sing it for you. Because one of the most beautiful melodies, it's an inspired melody. My wife and I heard it over this weekend with tears in our eyes. It's a magnificent melody, but here are the words. Here is love, vast as the ocean, loving kindness as the flood, when the Prince of Life, our ransom, shed for us his precious blood. Who his love will not remember? Who can cease to sing his praise? He can never be forgotten throughout heaven's eternal days. On the mount of crucifixion, fountains opened deep and wide. Through the floodgates of God's mercy flowed a vast and gracious tide. Grace and love, like mighty rivers, poured incessant from above. Heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed a guilty world in love. He offers you that kiss. He offers you that embrace today. You may be the apple of his eye. May God richly bless you. Thank you for giving me a hearing.